we'll make sure that the recording is made available through our website. Handing over to Hugh.
Okay, and apologies for that. And I'll just repeat my opening remarks in case they didn't get through. Thank you all for coming. We were pleased that legislation could be got through for Tasmania, South Australia and Queensland. But of course, we're very sorry to lose our friend and leader, Rodney Syme. And the board has been giving some thought to the way to preserve his legacy. We've had some ideas and we welcome ideas from you if you've got any you'd like to contribute. But with that, if Zoom is now under control. Mm-hmm. Yep. We'll now go on to welcome our guest speaker, and one of our doctors on the board, Nick Carr, is going to introduce that speaker.
Oh, the wonders of modern technology. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining the Dying with Dignity annual general meeting. We are incredibly privileged today to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Peter Langer. Peter is a geriatrician and was one of the first people as a specialist providing voluntary assisted dying care here in Victoria. And it's absolutely wonderful to have Peter here to talk to us, particularly as one of the issues that Rodney was so passionate about and would have communicated to people about the question of where does it fit to have end-of-life care when dementia rears its ugly head. So it is my absolute privilege to welcome Peter Langer here to address the annual general meeting of Dying with Dignity Victoria. All over to you, Peter.
Presentation.
Sure. Thunderous applause while we get the technology. Oh, I've got to move.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm very pleased to take the invitation to speak. And if you'll just give me a moment, I'll see if we can get my presentation up and running.
If anyone can still hear me, I'm incredibly impressed that Peter has managed, with fit testing for N95 masks, to still have a luxuriant facial growth and be allowed into hospital settings. That is a feat of engineering. When I first met Peter, he had an extremely luxuriant beard. So he's cut right back.
No, that's stopping share. Mm-hmm. We can stop share and then try again. Which one? That's the one. That's it.
Okay. Thanks, very. Hopefully everybody can see my slides now. Could you give a little nod or a thumbs up if that's the case, please? Very good, thank you. First of all, I'm affiliated with the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. I have to point out today that the opinions are mine only and not necessarily those of the organisations of which I'm a member. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And first, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. I am a geriatrician. That's a kind of internal medicine specialist in the care of older people. And a common question about that is, well, what defines that? You know, what kind of people do I see? And it's actually rather than necessarily any specific age, it's really defined more by the problems, such as dementia or delirium, or falls, or a decline in independence and the requirement for more support or incontinence. So this can be something which might be onset at a relatively young age due to certain other conditions. For example, in Down syndrome, these develop relatively early, and yet in other people might remain extremely fit and healthy and avoid these problems essentially for their entire lives. So a large chunk of my day-to-day practice is to do with that first one. Perhaps up to 50% is managing dementia and delirium, and potentially the problems that result of those. And the others might accompany or be individual problems in and of themselves. The important feature about these problems is they're not usually the result of a single disease. There's often multiple interacting factors there. So I completed my training 12 years ago, and for a long time as the head of the acute medical unit at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And I'm now a clinical associate professor at the University of Melbourne with an ongoing clinical background and a research background. My involvement in VAD started, I guess, relatively late when consideration when speaking to a group, and I really have to thank you all for the incredible work and advocacy that you've done. As a personal belief, I supported voluntary assisted dying largely as a consequence of my belief in individual rights. But it really wasn't until the campaign was relatively well advanced here in Victoria, in particular, that I became involved mainly through advocacy, through medical organisations. More so it's involved in implementation and planning after the Act was passed by the Royal Melbourne Hospital and more generally. And subsequent to the Act being implemented, involved in the assessments, and so far as we can tell, those I did the third practitioner administration in Victoria, where most of you are aware that the default position in Victoria is that the VAD applicant must self-administer their own medication unless they're unable to, and that's in that situation it's referred to as a practitioner administration. And I've continued on with a large number of assessments, 2 in just the last week. So I thought it might be worth touching on for this audience, what's it like for the doctor to be involved in this? And I'll point out that this is an entirely personal opinion and others may well feel differently. So the self-administration pathway is something which is relatively distant from the practitioner. And even necessarily and some people like the doctor to be present when they take their substance, even so it's a relatively distant thing. Practitioner administration for me and for some I've spoken to, it's another thing entirely. And while I had lifelong support of voluntary assisted dying, even I was surprised by the vehemence of the sort of deep prohibition against taking life that arose, even when the participant was literally asking me to do it. Subsequently, I think it gets easier, but I don't think it's ever going to be easy. And for me and for others, I think it raises the issue of practitioners of burden and burnout. And that's an ongoing consideration in being able to have a scheme which gives reasonable access to voluntary assisted dying for those who wish to access it. So I'll turn a little to discuss the topic I was asked to today and talk a bit about dementia. And as a good scientist, I'm going to define what it is first. So dementia is an umbrella term for about 200 different diseases, and the common feature of these is that there is a progressive loss of cognitive abilities. Different diseases will perhaps have different abilities, defined and changing first, but eventually all are lost. Now, one division of these, which can be useful for people to understand, is in the idea of cognitive domains. And the brain has many abilities, and it's not one linear from good to bad. So you can think of the abilities as, for example, memory. And I think most of you would be familiar with Alzheimer's disease, where memory loss is one of the early manifestations. But the brain also has a role in making decisions and executive function, and frontal lobe dementias can impact on those early on as some of their first manifestations, leading to people having apparently intact memory, but having marked changes in their personalities or their actions as a result of the loss of those inhibitions. Language is another ability of the brain, of course. So there are dementias where there's specific impacts on language, and vision and perception is another important part of the brain's abilities, and there are dimensions which specifically impact on those. They're progressive diseases and late in the course, they will all tend to spread out and all tend to look and present much the same. Dementia in and of itself is not a terminal disease. It will never cause the heart to stop beating or similar. Death arises from dementia as a result of the complications that develop. And one of those common ones might be, for example, when motor function, physical abilities and coordination is affected such that people are no longer able to appropriately swallow food and fluid, which results in that travelling down the trachea, down into the lungs and causing what's called an aspiration pneumonia. That's a common cause of death. In other events, the thirst and hunger areas of the brain might be impacted by the disease. So people will feel entirely comfortable, feel satiated, not feel thirsty, but nevertheless be losing weight or becoming dehydrated. And that increases the vulnerability to other diseases, but unfortunately in and of itself is not necessarily terminal. As I alluded to, there are a large variety of types. So you might be familiar with Alzheimer's. This is one of the most common, accounting for perhaps 50 to 60 to even 70% of disease. And it's often considered synonymous with dementia, but there are other varieties. So memory loss is very common here. Vascular dementia is the second most common, which is the impact of many very small strokes, individually, none of which might necessarily be noted. But they add up over time to cause dementia. The third most common is actually a combination of those first two, because they're actually so common that they will coexist in many individuals. After that, some which you may have heard of, and there's increasing awareness of Lewy body dementia, where there are visual hallucinations and delusions, and what we call Parkinsonism, which is the manifestations of Parkinson's disease with stiffness and tremor and difficulty moving, although not precisely due to Parkinson's disease. Although that disease itself can lead to dementia later in the course, typically after up to 10 years of illness. Now, some of the rarer dementias, such as primary progressive aphasia, might cause a loss of speech, and particularly a loss of speech expression, although such people may be able to continue to effectively communicate by indicating yes or no. And another variant is something called posterior cortical atrophy, where visual perception is affected first and foremost, such that people will have perfectly well functioning visual system and eyes, but the part of the brain which processes that becomes progressively damaged, this being a variant of Alzheimer's disease. I wanted to point out those last couple of variants because it will come to pass, we'll be considering the topic of capacity and decision-making capacity. So there is a perception in the community that anybody with any kind of dementia will not be able to make any decisions around themselves. And I think, and that may be eventually true, but I think you hopefully can see if somebody has a loss of speech alone, and those other abilities are preserved, they might nevertheless be able to continue to have decision-making capacities, perhaps requiring some support to be able to make decisions for themselves. Life expectancy in this illness is generally a very slowly progressive condition. Alzheimer's being the most common is the best defined. So the range is from a comparatively rapid 3 years up to a very long 20 years. And excuse me, the average from diagnosis to death is about 8 years. There are some variants which are rapidly progressive. In those, and that might be less than 12 months, which of course will be of relevance with the legislation in Victoria and much of the proposed or enacted legislation around Australia specifying that the expected prognosis must be less than 12 months. Some of the rapidly progressive dementias might progress quite rapidly, but unfortunately incapacity is also usually present at diagnosis with these rapidly progressive dementias, which tend to affect all areas at once. So I think you can, what I'm alluding to is I think the idea that it's under our existing legislation, it will be difficult for patients to retain what's called capacity through the entire process of voluntary assisted dying as it stands in Australia at the moment. When I talk about capacity, what we're talking about is the ability to consider and to make reasonable decisions. So in general, if we think about those cognitive domains, what you need to have capacity to make decisions is relatively intact memory. It doesn't have to be perfect. It depends on the decision and the complexity of that. So capacity is also specific to the task, and someone might be quite impaired and have some difficulty in VAD, but nevertheless have entirely appropriate capacity to decide what they would like to have for breakfast, for example. So these are specific functions. They'll also require executive function. I talked about some of those frontal lobe dementias where that kind of decision-making ability is lost relatively early in the course of that illness. So we can accommodate difficulties with visuospatial, we can accommodate difficulties with language, with assistance to communicate, but generally we require memory and executive function to be functioning quite well. So as I said, these may be preserved early in some dementia types, and there is usually a period of where capacity is retained if diagnosis is early enough. So people might have some difficulties, but nevertheless, and this is a common question that comes to me, not just on voluntary assisted dying, but for example, perhaps making a will, selling a house, that someone has been diagnosed with dementia, and we need to determine whether they have the capacity to make this decision. So that's something I'm well used to. Dealing particularly with capacity in voluntary assisted dying, all of our Australian legislation requires capacity at all stages of the VAD process, from the first assessment through the second and final assessment, all the way through to the dispensing of the medication and when consuming the medication. Also in this area, there are generally pretty strict provisions about who can assist the patient to take the medication. And in Victoria, where I'm most familiar with this, because it's actually a crime for anybody else to assist the person to take their medication. Even the practitioner has to request a specific permit from the health department for that one practitioner to be able to assist the person to take their voluntary assisted dying medication at all. For these reasons, I think with our existing legislation, it's very, very difficult, and I really find it difficult to see that any patient with dementia as a reason for accessing voluntary assisted dying will be able to do so in Australia. I think the more common scenario which is going to come up is a person who has some degree of dementia and also another terminal diagnosis such as cancer or some other issue, and it will be an important assessment to assure under our current legislation that they'll be able to access that because they have capacity to make that decision through all stages. There were some proposed amendments to the New South Wales legislation, including a specific prohibition on patients with dementia being able to access voluntary assisted dying, and I was able to outline for these reasons that I've given you why patients with dementia should not be specifically excluded from accessing for voluntary assisted dying. It should be assessed on a case-by-case basis, even with our current legislation. So I'll draw then to advanced health directives, which may or may not be familiar with you. I'll introduce them. They're variously discussed as advanced care planning or living wills or advanced care directives. So these are documents wherein patient will put out a written expression of their wills and desire in the setting where they're no longer able to make those decisions, where they're incapacitated. They best come from a discussion about values or certain decisions about care undertaken with a medical professional who can assist to ensure that those will be expressed appropriately and will get the outcomes that the person is looking for. In Victoria, there's a couple of different options here. So there is an instructional directive, that you can make out. So these hold force of legislation now. So you can attend a medical practitioner and you can make out an advanced health directive in an instructional manner, which is binding. It is crime to go for a medical practitioner or any kind of health professional to take an action which is contrary to an instructional directive. As an example, some of these which I've seen have been from Jehovah's Witnesses, who have a religious prohibition against the use of blood or blood products. And they complete an instructional directive which specifically states that they don't wish to have blood products, even if they're incapacitated, even if it were a life-saving. And in that form, as an instructional directive, that's a binding commitment which no health professional can go against without significant consequence. Another kind of advanced health directive here in Victoria is what's called a values directive. This expresses a person's belief and values to help health professionals to guide decisions about those. For example, this might take the form of a statement such as, I find value in life by living at home, being amongst my family, being able to converse and enjoy their company. And if that were not possible, with no likelihood of being able to regain that quality of life, then I would not want life-prolonging treatment. So a values directive might not specifically state I do not want this treatment, blood products or similar, but provide some guidance and directives for that situation where the person might be incapacitated, but wishes somebody to be aware of what they would like in that circumstance, with some flexibility to help in that, because there are many different situations where that might be the case, and that values directive can be very useful in helping us to ensure that that person's wishes and values are respected. Another option is to appoint a medical treatment decision maker, and this is a sort of a new term for a medical enduring power of attorney. So this appoints a specific person to make those decisions for someone else in the event, again, that they're incapacitated. So this can often be quite useful if and so long as the medical treatment decision maker understands, for example, those values. It's not particularly useful if they're appointed and nevertheless and don't have a clear idea of what the person would have wanted if they were incapacitated. Under the Medical Treatment Decisions Act, I think it was 2015, you can also appoint a support person who doesn't have a formal role as a medical treatment decision maker, but would nevertheless come aboard to assist the person to make decisions. And this, I have to say, is perhaps not a very popular measure, because I've never seen one nor met one. Typically, it's the first three which have been most useful and which I've seen taken up repeatedly, and it's quite important. So as a standard part of my my assessment and assessment of new patients, I would discuss the presence of those, and we talk about making one out if not present. So there are some limitations, and advanced health directives in Victoria cannot require or specify voluntary assisted dying. That's specifically excluded in the legislation. They can't be used to aid what at the time the Act was brought into place was called suicide, for example, by refusing all treatments and then attempting suicide. And in that circumstance, there's been some specific guidance which says that such even a instructional directive wouldn't necessarily apply. It can specify that life-prolonging measures may not be undertaken. So in an instructional or a values directive, it's entirely reasonable, and really it's the purpose of this in many cases to guide against life-prolonging measures that aren't going to be in keeping with the person's wishes or values, typically because they're not going to preserve the kind of quality of life that people feel is necessary and without which they do not wish to continue living. So in a shorthand and in ethical terminology, it is okay to omit life-prolonging measures, but with these advanced health directives, it's not okay to commit or commission measures which would shorten life. So that's specifically excluded. And a rather amateur student of philosophy and ethics, but I've yet to find a particularly convincing argument that explains why omission is different to commission. There is another jurisdiction where that is not the case, and I wanted to talk about the Netherlands, which has had voluntary assisted dying legislation since 2001. And in more recent times in the Netherlands, an advanced health directive can specify for voluntary assisted dying. So they have a number of requirements here. The advanced health directive must be valid, so the person must have had capacity in what they would, in their usual terms, to be when they made out their advanced health directive. So for example, and it's actually fairly similar to what we have here in Victoria, they must be well appraised of the consequences of their decision, i.e. that taking a voluntary assisted dying substance will cause someone to pass away, cause them to pass away, to be specific. They must be aware of their illness and other options around that illness and all the potential cares, and make a free and considered decision, which is enduring to take up VAD in that circumstance. So it's sort of exactly the same decision that's taken in Victoria, but taken in advance. Now, in advance, there's a further requirement that should the person with, and it's typically going to be about dementia, lose capacity, and the advanced health directive then sort of come into place, that the physician must be, and I quote here, alert to any behaviours and utterances that may indicate resistance or objections to the termination of life. If this is the case, then euthanasia may not be performed. So what it's saying here is, even if capacity is lost and the advanced health directive would apply, so for example, stating a concourse might be that somebody who has dementia might make an advanced health directive which says that they do not wish to enter into a nursing home, and if that is required for ongoing care of dementia, then that would be the circumstance which they would like voluntary assisted dying. So in that circumstance, even in that case, the person might not have capacity to clearly understand all the aspects of voluntary assisted dying, but they still need essentially to agree and indicate and not indicate that they no longer wish to take that forward. So here we think a little bit about the concepts of informed consent, where somebody has a full and complete understanding of all the aspects of their decision, and something called assent, where somebody might agree to a decision without necessarily being aware of all of the ramifications. So the Netherlands requires that informed consent must have been present when full capacity was present, but there must be ongoing assent and ongoing agreement that might take place even when the person is relatively disabled. I imagine that many of you fairly avidly follow international discussion around voluntary assisted dying. And there has been quite a bit in the last few years around a case in the Netherlands where things didn't go well. And a lot has been drawn from that case. So I did want to talk specifically about it, both as an idea about how things could go well and how things they could perhaps not go well, and the ramifications of that case for discussion. Because I think a lot's been drawn from it, which is potentially not appropriate. So this was a Dutch woman in her 1970s, in her 70s, who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And she'd made a valid, she had dementia, she had a diagnosis, but she had capacity for what would normally be considered advanced voluntary assisted dying in the Netherlands. And so she wrote this out, and this has been translated, but she stated in her advanced health directive, I absolutely do not want to be placed in an institution for elderly dementia patients. I want to take a dignified farewell from my precious loved ones, trusting that At the time when the quality of my life has ended up in the above described situation, I would like to undergo voluntary euthanasia. Further, she said in that Advanced Health Directive, I want to make use of the legal right to undergo voluntary euthanasia when I am still at all mentally competent and am no longer able to live at home with my husband. And this will have some consequences, which we'll see. So unfortunately, her dementia progressed and she often recalled her intent and said that she wanted to die, but felt that her quality of life was good and stated she wanted to die, but not yet. Unfortunately, it continued to progress and her care needs increased such that her husband was no longer able to care for her at home. And she was, after a period of emergency care, she was admitted to a nursing home as her husband was no longer able to care for her. In that circumstance, her husband noted her Advanced Health Directive provision that came into force in that specific circumstance and asked for it to be implemented. At that point in the nursing home, she said that she regularly said that she wanted to die, but again said, but it's not so bad yet. So she perhaps had lost some insight into how she would have felt the living in a nursing home would impact on her quality of life. One of the requirements in the Dutch legislation is intolerable suffering. And that was certainly noted. She missed her husband, although he was there daily. She had difficulty understanding why he had to leave and would be quite upset when he had to leave her. So the process continued forward in keeping with the legislation. So she was evaluated by 2 other physicians who agreed that the requirements had been met, and the voluntary assisted dying was arranged. So a sedative was placed in her coffee without her knowledge. Now, I might remind you that she, at this stage, had been saying, yes, she wanted to die, but not yet. And the Dutch legislation requires that the physicians be aware at all times for any indication that the person might not assent at that time. So this will come up later. An additional sedative was injected and an intravenous line was inserted. Now, in many of this is going into the technical details, but in many protocols for intravenous administration of these substances, they can be quite irritating to the veins, which results in quite a lot of pain. So many of these recommend that intravenous lignocaine is first administered. So that goes directly into the vein and provides the vein itself with some local anaesthetic so that it's not painful when the medication is administered. The physician chose not to administer the lignocaine as it felt the earlier sedatives had been effective and instead gave the voluntary assisted medication intravenously, which was clearly quite painful because the patient awoke and sat up and the family held her down while they gave further medication causing death. It's very distressing, isn't it? It's just horrible reading about it and imagining the situation for all parties involved. So there is a review committee in the Netherlands which reviews these, and they certainly reviewed this one, and they found that the criteria, while they had been met, the physician in charge had failed to apply due care with regard to the request, with regard to that issue which I talked about as in terms of assent, and failed to apply due care with regard to the administration of the euthanasia medications. So my interpretation of this case is that this was really a problem of implementation, and very upset and wish that medical care was excellent and consistent everywhere and every time. But I have to say the doctor in this case was incompetent. They had failed to apply due care in keeping with the well-established standards. So a lot's been drawn from this case, and a lot of commentators have noted that this represents some kind of system-wide policy of involuntary euthanasia of patients with dementia. And this is just a highly inaccurate interpretation of the case. It was an issue of training, supervision and practice of that particular physician, and not necessarily an issue with policy overall which if it were applied would have avoided this situation. So the policy, I think, stands as good policy and good procedure, but it just wasn't followed in this instance. And that really highlights the importance of good training, supervision and practice in all areas, but particularly in voluntary assisted dying. So I'll change topic, and this is the last thing I wanted to discuss today. Given that situation that that advanced health directives cannot specify for voluntary assisted dying in Victoria, and I suspect it won't be the case anywhere in Australia, what can you do to avoid this parlous situation? First, I would recommend to you that if you felt that living with significant dementia, and it certainly can be a distressing condition both to the person in that situation and certainly when considering yourself in future with that kind of disability, I'd suggest that you write an advanced health directive, and you might consider to make out an instructional directive that will specify that any therapy that might prolong life is not to be given in those circumstances. And this, I'd recommend that you take this up with probably someone who knows you well in terms of your medical practitioner, and who understands and is responsive to your values and decisions about what about life you find valuable and what you would want to have happen if those things weren't present. So be able to specify those circumstances and say, and be clear that you would not want measures that might prolong life. Although it's not part of legislation, and this will have no legally binding power at the moment, I don't know what's going to happen in future, and things may change. And this organisation and allied organisations have done a fantastic job of advocating for change in Australia. Really tremendous, and I have to thank you for that. But so things may change such that if you make out an advanced health directive now, it's possible, I must say unlikely, but it is possible that things might change such that it would be valid. So you might choose to specify that if euthanasia was permitted, that you wish that that would be administered to you in those circumstances that you choose. You would be well advised, because this would be in keeping with what's happening in the Netherlands, to obtain an assessment at that time. You made that out. That confirms your capacity to do so, that confirms that you're, I guess, of sound mind in terms of making that decision. So that's my suggestion to you. It might not work. It certainly doesn't carry the force of law at the moment, and would be considered to be invalid. But who knows what the future may bring, and this might be one way of ensuring that your wishes are respected in future. And I think you would keep a close eye on what's happening in the legislative space, as I'm sure you all will as members of this fine organisation. And should the law change, take up this at your first available opportunity. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. That's me in more, as Nick pointed out, more heavily bearded days. And I've some contact details on the left, and hopefully we've got some time for questions.
Yes, and I'm just going to lean over Peter's shoulder and say, first of all, thank you so much, Peter. That's fantastic. A couple of questions have come through, so I'm just going to go through them. First one's from Annie Whitelock. Wants to know what other neurological diseases are not accepted for voluntary assisted dying.
So the Act says that it doesn't specifically say anything is not acceptable. It specifies that the life expectancy must be less than 12 months, which can be really tricky. And a lot of my time is spent working with colleagues to help them to understand what is required here and what request is the issue. And it does require that capacity is maintained through all phases of that illness. So that can be very individual, and there are neurological diseases which, just in the range of that disease, might be very disabling and likely to cause death within 12 months and not affect capacity, and therefore would be eligible, but the same disease with some different manifestations. So a specific example here might be multiple sclerosis, which might be very rapidly progressive, clearly going to cause someone to pass away within 12 months and preserve capacity, or a different variant of the same disease with different manifestations, very slow moving, with some impact on cognition might well be something which is neither likely to cause someone to pass away within 12 months, nor retain their capacity to be able to make that decision under their current legislation. So I hope the short answer is no, and it depends, as is often the case in medicine. I apologise for that answer, but it's on an individual basis.
And there's a great question from Chrysanthi Ava, which is how are we moving forward for the eligibility for access to voluntary assisted dying for diagnosed mental illness?
So this is a little outside my field.
The answer is we're not.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Mitch. Yeah, I think I have to agree. There's very little, I think, movement on that, and we're still looking at that for terminal illness. I think one of the things that we can focus on here is, again, just like with dementia and the general perception that anybody with any degree of dementia must not be able to make their own decisions and must be vulnerable and incapable and require protection from those evil VAD doctors. There's a perception, I think, that anyone with any degree of mental illness cannot make an informed decision about VAD. So I think, moving forward, we need to be very clear that there are mental illnesses which are fluctuating, coming and going. There are mental illnesses which are severe and disabling and nevertheless preserve capacity to be able to make these kinds of decisions, and that the very presence of these illnesses does not necessarily exclude the ability to participate in VAD. I think if we can get over that, at least, that will be a major step forward. And then if we can, the other big step, I think, would be moving from VAD as solely something for a terminal illness to something which causes intolerable suffering in and of itself.
I'm completely terrified that someone from the wrong organisation is going to get hold of this and take out the clip of Peter Langer saying we've got to protect people with any form of dementia from these awful people who provide voluntary assisted dying. So please don't forward this to the wrong people. There's one more question here. The policy does discuss suffering which might need to be considered. I'm going to take that as a comment, and we have to move on with the AGM. So I'd like people to join me in thanking Peter Langer very, very much for joining us today. Thank you, Peter. Over to you, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Peter. Next item on the agenda is something which we've had in place for many years now. Whenever it was some years ago, we instituted a thing known as the Rodney Award. This was given to someone who was deemed to have made a very significant contribution to our cause, and our Vice President, Jane Morris, is going to introduce the speaker.
Hello, everyone, and I agree. Thanks, Peter. That was most interesting talk. Thank you. Yes, I'm here to announce the recipient of the 2021 Rodney Syme Award, of which the associated honour has become all the more significant with the death of Rodney not so long ago. The medal was first awarded in 2007 in recognition of the distinguished effort in pursuit of the Dying with Dignity cause. It was first awarded to Marshal Perron, and since then we've had many distinguished recipients. I know if I name them, I'll leave people out, but I will try to name a couple. Max Sutherland, Peter Short, who was the face of the campaign for the Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying Act. We had last year the 2 Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying Care Navigators. We've had Anne Riddell, Andrew Denton, Helga Coos, and a few politicians, Fiona Patton, Gavin Jennings, and Colleen Hartland. This year, the award goes to a Tasmanian politician. He introduced a bill, the End of Life Choice Act, the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, into the Tasmanian Parliament last year. Many said he wouldn't achieve success because he was an independent, he was from the upper house, and it was a private member's bill. But success he certainly did achieve. In fact, he achieved what was we believe to be a world first, in as much as the upper house, he achieved a unanimous vote in last December. The bill then went to the lower house in March this year, where it was passed 16 votes to 6, and on the 23rd of March returned to the upper house, where it was legislated for, and so Tasmania became the 3rd Australian state to pass VAD legislation. This award goes to Michael Gaffney, the member for Mersey. And I think what we saw in Parliament, what he did was just the tip of the iceberg, all his work. He worked for years around this bill. He travelled overseas. He held numerous consultations with the community. And since the passage of the bill, he's kept up this pace of work, informing Tasmanians about what to expect when this bill is finally implemented. He took an evidence-based approach in the Tasmanian Parliament, and he also proved to people the success of political compromise, and it was gracious political compromise. Mike won the adoration of a lot of people. He was always humble, always modest, and showed respect to every single other member of Parliament. He conducted himself in this dignified way throughout the whole debate, and I think restored for many people their faith in politicians. For this reason, we can't think of a more worthy recipient than Mike Gaffney. COVID has put another blow on everything, and we did invite Mike to attend, which he's unable, so he did send us a message, which we will now let you see. Thank you.
The sun's not coming through. Sorry?
Can you put your sound on?
My sound is on.
Travel unwise, especially with parliamentary commitments where I need to be present. Hi. I wish I could be at your meeting to meet with you all. Travel unwise, especially with parliamentary commitments where I need to be present. It's been a very exciting year for voluntary assisted dying movement in Australia. So much momentum and genuine feeling of hope. It would be remiss of me not to recognise the great work of the Victorian and the Australian, Western Australian legislation, which provides the impetus for other states to progress VAD. However, for Tasmania, South Australia and Queensland to all pass legislation in the same year is a huge result. Surely it will not be long before New South Wales and both territories also receive the legislation they deserve. I'm in very good company, accepting this award, whose namesake was indeed a pioneer in the Australian VAD space. I'm sure there are many of those whose early introduction to VAD was through the efforts of Dr. Rodney, himself counselling over 2,000 patients at tremendous risk to his reputation and registration. His impact on the Tasmanian journey was immense, from providing introductions to international experts, making comments on the consultation bill, to giving his time to discuss concerns and queries I had. He was always there. Rod's death is a very sad moment in time. However, importantly, his life will be remembered and treasured by many. As we all know, awards such as these are the result of the efforts of many, many people. I've been fortunate to have received great support from many international, national and local friends, both individuals and organisations. I cannot speak more highly of the wider VAD community. And like with all sensitive issues, there will always be difference of opinions, and each piece of legislation will reflect different environments and expectations. Indeed, the Tasmanian journey is one that I take immense pride of being part of that challenge. The opportunity to introduce legislation that is necessary, that is just and well received by the Tasmanian people is a journey I'll never forget. You guys all appreciate how much work is involved in getting any legislation passed. And I must at this time also like to thank Bonnie Phillips, Robin Webb, Philip Spratt, Jack and Nat Gray, Dying with Dignity Tasmania, notably Hildy, Margaret and Robin, and all of those Tasmanians who've worked so hard to achieve this goal. The end result was significant. A unanimous decision in the upper house with all 15 members supporting the legislation, and a 19-6 result in the lower house, which was also a tremendous result, especially considering the 3 previous bills originating in the lower house did not even progress to the committee stage. I actually think a good speech is a short speech, and all I can say is once again, thank you. I feel very honoured to have been chosen when I'm well aware that there are so many people who could have been selected for this prestigious award. I wish you all the very best, and everybody have a great Christmas and New Year.
Okay, now we get to the technical part of the meeting. Don't go to sleep. We'll make sure that we get through it very quickly. We have the minutes of the previous meeting. If you bear with me a sec, I will just see if I can share my screen. Thank you. Okay, so we're down to the minutes of the previous AGM, which have been circulated with the notice of the AGM. I'm going to allow everybody to unshare. If I can in a sec. Okay. Now that we're over the speakers, if you do want to say anything, you can now unmute yourself and either make a comment or ask a question. Do I have a mover to accept the minutes of the previous meeting that were circulated in the notice of meeting? Moved by Mark, seconded by Natalie. Do I have any dissenters? If not, we'll take those as accepted. The President's report, you've heard.
We'll come later.
We'll come. We're up to the President's report. I'm going to hand over to Hugh to make the President's report. Bear with me a sec.
We've done our detailed President's report. I just want to make a very much briefer summary of some of the major events of this last year and other things which we've been doing and may do in the future. With Rodney's passing, of course, we're all very sorry to lose a friend, but we do, as I said before, we do have plans to preserve the work he's done and his memory, and we'll work towards doing that. We're of course very pleased with the success of the other 3 states. We now have about 2/3 of Australians who have access to assisted dying legislation, and as Mike Gaffney said, the rest must surely follow. In terms of our task to make sure as best we can the implementation works, we've had some assistance. The member of the upper house of the state of Victoria, Stuart Grimley, introduced a bill into Parliament to seek some amendments to the Act. That wasn't successful, but we're of course very grateful for his support. We've also had very good support from the VAD Review Board and the navigators who work out of Peter Mclaren. What we've done for ourselves, following our conference of last year, we've maintained 2 monthly meetings with the other members of the other states' Dying with Dignity organisations, which we've found has been very helpful both to us and to them in keeping ideas around and helping each other out. We've also continued with our program of providing witnesses where required to that stage in the assisted dying process where witnesses are required. We've so far made 261 declarations in respect to 145 patients, and we're told that the provision of this service is much appreciated. On our board, we are very fortunate to have 2 such very active doctors. Cam Mclaren presents his apologies for today, but we have, as you've seen, Nick Carr here with us. Nick has assisted many patients in assisted dying. He's made presentations to the public. And he persists in our work in seeking to overcome the problems of telehealth. He's been a leader in that exercise. Cam Mclaren, our oncologist, has apparently made 160 assisted dying applications. He's made numerous presentations, and Nick and Cam made presentations to the Tasmanian government, which I feel must surely have been influential in the outcome. We are aware that we are not getting out the information required enough. It has been very difficult to adjust to the various lockdowns, but we will now seek to make that much more a part of what we do. We are also seeking to provide information in other languages, and we're fortunate to have had a new member, Victor C, provide versions in Chinese. And if any of you have got expertise in other languages, please let us know. We may seek your assistance. You may be aware we've redone our website, and we're very grateful to Sue James, who's done most of the work in doing that. We also thank the Dying with Dignity Victoria members who volunteered their stories, and we encourage all of you to do so. That makes an impact in the provision of the information. Our Facebook and social media presence has progressed a great deal. Thanks to one of our workers, Sabrina, and also in particular Jane Morris. Jane's also done further work in seeking to provide other services to do with such things as bereavement counselling and assistance for families who may be experiencing some reflections after the death of a member of their family, and that work is progressing. We've made an initiative to do with the provision of voluntary assisted dying within the facilities of aged care, residential aged care. Some of you may have noticed on our website that we've now got a collection of them who have identified themselves as being facilities which will provide assistance to people who seek it within their organisations. And again, we intend to expand the range of facilities that are listed there. Media Watch continues and provides a very useful service of events both in Australia and around the world. Mark Newstead, our treasurer, will talk shortly about finances, which I consider to be in good shape. And lastly, to do with our opponents, you may think we do very little with them, but Rodney kept on reminding us that they really are not a significant significant presence in any real sense. They are vocal, but if you examine the arguments that they present, they are really devoid of substance. And so we don't make any attempt to spend much time working against them. So I'll now hand over to Mark Newstead for the Treasurer's report. Thanks, Mark.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody promises to keep it brief, but this is, after all, the occasion when the Treasurer presents an open report, so there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of the information that is to be made available. Last year, I was able to do a PowerPoint presentation. I have completed it, but I can't transmit it this afternoon, but I will organise to have it available through the website, and it will be in the same simple half-dozen slide formats, which summarises it. So I just wish to talk to the information, quite dense information that's available in the Treasurer's statement, and just tell you a really simple explanation of the guiding principles by which a business, an organisation, a charity, a household, anybody that has to measure their performance against the intrinsic value of money and the need for money and how we are performing. Last year, I reported what in effect was a very good turnaround from the year of 2019, the pre-COVID year, to a financial year result ending in 2020, which saw a considerable increase of income for the organisation, Dying with Dignity Victoria, to 180,000, up on 65,000 from the income in the previous year, 2019. Now, we've maintained an increase, but not at such an heroic rate. We've increased our income from 180,000 in 2020 to the financial year finished in June 30th this year to a total of 214,000. That's an increase of 34,000 in the income. So on the basis of, are we doing well? Yes, our income has increased. We have, however, slightly expanded the rate of expenditure after previously slashing it considerably by reorganising both the staffing levels, responsibilities, and location. 2 years ago, we went out of the situation of hiring a physical office space with a staff of 1 permanent and 2 part-time people, and turned it into a much more focused organisation, including 1 almost full-time executive. And in fact, we've made an increase in the responsibilities through our General Manager, Natalie King, and therefore we reversed the business of continuing to reduce expenditure. But the organisation is still getting the benefit of a lower cost base. Like all vibrant organisations in the capitalist economy, we can report generally an improvement in our net performance. So our expenditure last year, ending 2020, was 117,000, down from 174, which is when we made the big savings. And this year we've increased our expenditure, but not by much. We've gone from 117 to 136, so a very modest increase in there. And as we've indicated, we've increased the expenditure in order to improve the level of service. We also spent more this year than in previous years in that wave of support for the other Dying with Dignity organisations, of which you heard the most immediately successful were in Tasmania. Even though much of that was a homegrown effort, we still provided funds. In fact, Tasmania, to their credit, actually returned a proportion of the funds that were offered to them to assist. So they, like we, operate honestly and abstemiously and only apply funds when they're actually needed. In the end result, therefore, for the year 2021, I'll summarise, we had a net gain on last year's difference between the income and the expenditure of just under 78,000, 77.8 to be precise. That means that we've now continued the performance and tradition of being careful with our expenditure, improving our income, and showing a performance of accruing to important increase in the gap between what we spend and what we receive. Part of what we receive, which is different this year, has been the evolution of an investment committee, a financial subcommittee, which looks carefully at nearly 300,000 asset base, which is in liquid, well, semi-liquid funds, in exchange traded shares, which has ridden the value of the performance of the stock exchange cycle. This is not gambling. This is considered, careful and prudent investment. And indeed, in our first investment decision for the first year of operation with exchange traded funds, we have actually slightly altered our emphasis away from the more conservative balance to a greater balance on funds, which have historically in the last 12 months proved to be more remunerative and certainly seem to be the way of the future. As a consequence, we are always mindful that the performance in the past does not predicate the same level of performance in the future, but there has been a considered basis to make that change in the asset basis of our investment through the Vanguard company, and there may be others down the line. And on that basis, we are not only increasing our capital surplus, but we are making sure that it undergoes reasonable stewardship through careful consideration. On our financial subcommittee, we also have a member whose professional basis is dealing with investment advice and the judicious investment of funds. But we have her application, Dana Droog, to be completely voluntary, like all of the efforts and the activity that members of the DWDV board and executive apply to all of their work for this particular organisation. So with that brief but hopefully clear summary of where we stand, I'll open it for any questions that may wish to be raised.
And I've advised the Treasurer that I opened it on the chat for questions. No questions have come through so far.
Oh, good. We can go off to Rio when it's legal to do so. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Could I just have a mover to accept the Treasurer's report? Sue Cummings, and a seconder. Hugh, all those in favour, against, that's carried. Next item on the agenda is the election of board members, and there's been 8 nominations received, 4 for the office bearer positions and 4 for the ordinary members on the board. We've had a nomination for President of Dying with Dignity Victoria from Hugh Sargent, for Vice President Jane Morris, for Secretary Meredith Doig, and for Treasurer Mark Newstead. Then for the ordinary members of the board, we have Nick Carr, Cam Mclaren, Sue Cummings, and Lynn Stavridis. I think it's probably okay to move those as a block. Do I have a mover for those nominations? Jeff Lerner, and a seconder. Nick Carr, all those in favour, against, thank you very much. I'll declare those people elected to the board until the annual general meeting of next year, so for 12 months. Thank you. Now I'll hand it back to Hugh.
Okay, and we're almost there. We cannot take new motions, as we can only take motions on notice, but we can have questions or comments about anything you'd like to ask about. Are there any questions or comments?
I'll just point out that you can unmute yourself now and ask your question directly if you wish to do so. Any in the chat, Nick? Anybody like to make a comment? No?
Well, silence is golden. We can close the meeting. We can note that the board is going to do a workshop at the end of this month to make a sort of plan for the next medium term to consider what we need to change and have that noted and agreed to. I want to thank all our members for the support you give us. Our volunteers, there's many of you who give of your time. That is all very useful to our cause. And of course, we have our members of the board. I am extraordinarily fortunate to have such a talented and hardworking team to help us do all these things. They are a talented bunch whose many range of skills covers for the many things which I do not do very well. And I am very, very grateful to all of them. You have today met on our board Meredith, the Secretary, Jane Morris, the Vice President, Mark Newstead, our Treasurer. You've also met Nick Carr. There are two here today that you have not met, and I would like just to introduce you to Sue Cummings, who's one of our new board members. Sue has, along with Mark, got experience in media matters and in marketing, and she's been very helpful to us in our work to do with the aged care facilities. And Natalie King, who many of you will know, to a degree, the star of the show, who works tirelessly, who gives counselling, who runs the show. Natalie, okay, stand up and take a bow or something. And with that, I think that closes the meeting. Thank you all and good afternoon.
No questions going through.